Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I am happy to see everyone, and I think we will have some additional people joining. And those of you that are watching the recording, I'm Terry Pepper, and I'm your moderator today. And we're going to be talking about alternative legal service providers in 2024. Where are we and where are we going? Which is a practical discussion on the expanding legal ecosystem. And we have a really distinguished group of panelists today. So let me introduce them. I'm going to give you some brief bios about each of our panelists, and you can learn more about them on the college's website. So we'll start with Kanur Chopra. I practiced saying it, and I hope I said that right. Kanur is the VP of Legal Services at Elevate, and she's been involved in legal services outsourcing in that industry since 2004, when she founded one of the pioneer companies in the industry. And her vision has always been to create a platform for customers that provides them with the best, most effective, and efficient options to obtain and manage legal services. Then next we have Emily Mallory, who's the Managing Director at Moray Global. She supports general counsels and chief compliance officers in their efforts to develop, communicate, execute, and validate their legal business processes and their compliance programs. And then Kyle McNeil is a contracts lifecycle management practice leader at E&Y Law. And his mission is to help companies identify sources of value and to solve business challenges in domains where contracting is a core activity in the business process. My role is CEO of the Elite Global Law Firm Network, Teralex. So just a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. The first is that if you have questions, you can pose them in the chat, and you're welcome to do it to everybody. But if it's a sensitive question and before you'd rather I pose it for you, just send me a private note in the chat and I will pose it for you without disclosing you. So with no further ado, let's dive into the program, and I'm just going to kick it off by setting the stage briefly. We're going to talk today about alternative legal service providers, and really, what do we mean by that? And we mean companies or entities that offer legal services sort of outside of the traditional law firms. And we see that ALSPs use tools often like technology, optimization, process management, and things like that to bring a different level of discipline that many law firms, and I come from the law firm world, find very difficult to replicate. I looked up a little bit of statistics just so I could set the stage here, and this comes from Thomson Reuters' latest data, but they're saying that the market for alternative legal services providers is showing itself to be a very highly dynamic part of the overall legal ecosystem, and we actually think that it's really not alternative anymore. It's sort of mainstream, but they comprise a $20.6 billion segment of the legal market, and they recently have experienced a compound annual growth rate of 20% between 2019 and 2021. That is a significant jump up from the compounded annual growth rate of 15% recorded in the prior years between 2017 and 2019. That reveals that there's this evolving legal market where the boundaries between ALSPs, law firms, corporate law departments, and even technology and software firms, a little bit of which will be represented on our panel today, are rapidly blurring. So as I mentioned, we're indeed moving from these being alternatives to them being quite mainstream. So let me dig in, and I'm going to start asking some questions to the panelists. But like I said, if you have a question, just pose it in the chat and I'll either answer it, ask it on your behalf, or if it's private, or I'll just read it out and you can unmute and give some more color commentary to your question if you have it. So welcome panelists and welcome everybody. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose some questions and pick a person to answer it first. And then the other panelists are prepared to jump in with some additional information if they feel that they have that, but not everyone will answer everything. But I'm going to start with you, Emily, if you don't mind. And I would like you to share with us what you think the macro environmental trends are that are fundamental to our discussion today on the current state and the future of ALSPs. And before you answer that, I should mention, we're not going to do a lot of prognostication at the front end. We're going to save that as the final wrap-up question. So stay tuned and stay with us so you get to hear the predictions. But Emily, why don't you tell us what the current state is?
Thanks, Terry. I think we both read the same Thomson Reuters report, because I had in my notes here that in the last 10 years, this report has shown that the market has actually doubled in size, which is pretty extreme growth. And so I know today we're not here to look back, we're here to look at today and look forward. part of understanding today and looking forward, I think is critical to understand the environmental factors that play into the decision-making of in-house legal departments and law firms as they're considering whether to use ALSPs for a variety of different types of services. So just very big picture, high level, we're all grappling with and living within a challenging economic environment, right? That's been ongoing for the last couple of years. That's certainly putting pressure on in-house legal teams. I spend a lot of time, I'm on the consulting side of the house, and so I spend much of my time working with general counsel on budgets and thinking about planning and strategic plans. And there's been so many, necessities to cut back or rethink hiring plans or rethink how work might be performed due to the economic pressures that we're all facing. Secondly, and I think this adds additional challenge on top of the economic environment, is the increasingly complex and quickly changing regulatory environment. This is again making it harder and harder for the in-house legal teams to manage changing and increasing workloads and tap into new subject matters when they're so strapped for time and workload. So there's a lot of rethinking of how can we get work done, who is involved in getting the work done, can technology help us get the work done more quickly? So I think those two pretty big picture environmental factors that we're all probably pretty familiar with really are fundamental to this conversation, because I think it's adding pressure and driving decision making when we speak with our in-house legal team clients.
Excellent, thank you. So Kyle and Kanor, did you want to add anything to that? And Kanor, I'm going to call on you next anyway, so if you have anything you want to add. Kyle? If not, Kanor, tell us what the role of technology is in all of this.
Sure. And yeah, and I'll play off kind of what Emily was sharing, is like, as Emily shared, technology, I think is going to play, and does play a big role in this. And look, I think just looking at the statistics you spoke about, there's a lot of, work out there for law firms, for law companies, and I'll use law companies instead of alternative legal service providers, because like you said, I don't think we're alternative. And I think we sit right there next to the law firms supporting the law departments. And it's a massive market. It is a huge market, and the 20.4 billion that you're mentioning is a very small piece of that, which law companies currently have. So I think it's a huge opportunity. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. So I don't think this is about kind of taking work away from law firms. There's just more to do, right? And I think technology plays a big role in that. So I think tech initially played a role in even creating this extension, I'd say, in the legal industry, right? The fact that 20 years ago, I started a company and I had people in this space, one of the first outsourcing companies 20 years ago, where people were doing work out of India, and, efficiency was kind of meant labor arbitrage. It was made possible because of the internet, because of technology. And back then it was being able to use e-discovery tools remotely, right? Or contract management tools, or do research, with respect to, prior art searches. So I think technology helped facilitate this extension of the legal industry to allow for law companies to participate, but then it also is playing a big role in how work is being done. And I think that, right now we've seen with AI and Gen AI, this big hype around it. And I think the hype is relevant because we do need the technology, and it is going to change how we work. But there's communications technology, there's collaboration technology that's being used, which is really critical, practice management and workflow. I think what's really interesting, and where you're seeing a lot of, I'd say, the innovation is in, e-discovery has kind of been around, right, for at least 30 years. So that's existed, but you're seeing evolution there. Contract management technology is so critical. From basic just managing contracts to now you're seeing AI-driven tools around contract review and contract extraction. There's other practice-specific tools within compliance, and all of these are really important because, again, the workload is increasing. As a company, we are, very tech forward. I'm very bullish on technology, and I am really excited about what's going on with respect to, AI, whether it's LLMs or Gen AI. And I think that's a place to watch. And as an example, and some of the things to think about there, and people are like, well, what are the use cases and what are people doing? And is anyone doing anything? And yes, people are, and there's a lot of experimentation. But like one of the things that we're doing with the company is we're using case text, which, many have probably heard the name of that tool, and we've customized it to actually do first drafts of discovery responses, right? Creating a repository of a company's responses and then being able to point the technology at that. That's going to save a ton of time and, of course, bring efficiency and cost effectiveness there, right? And so that's a potential use case. Cloud Court for desk testimony intelligence. So e-discovery, but look at that for, e-discovery for basically deposition testimony and transcripts. Huge game changer for companies that are involved in class actions and mass torts, who just, or even just have a lot of depots and, witness testimony to deal with. So that's a game changer. I just taught a law school class a couple hours ago, and I had Damien Reel talking about technology today. But what VLEX and Fastcase are doing around, legal research, but then being able to, draft kind of first drafts of different types of pleadings and incorporate legal arguments. It's fascinating what's happening. So, I think there's experimentation, and I think we're going to have to adopt a lot of that into how we are practicing in the future. So a little bit of, it's a little bit scary, but I think a lot of excitement and opportunity around it. But definitely need to embrace technology.
So I'm going to give a sub question, and any of the panelists feel free to answer this, but I've been to two general counsel programs in the last 6 months where literally on the stage, someone or another in a panel said, don't go to your outside law firms for help with adopting AI because they're just so far behind and don't know what they're doing yet. Is that your experience, or do you think that law firms are coming up equal to, alternative providers and corporate law departments and things? Anyone have any views on that?
I'll continue this, and then I'd love to hear from the panelists. Look, I think that, I don't know if they're equal to, I think that the reason that law companies exist is because, unfortunately, law firms didn't do as much as they could have, including, I think, around the use of technology. However, as I'm looking at the landscape right now, law firms have big, they're spending a lot of money internally on creating different types of technology. They are, I know as soon as kind of this hype around Gen AI happened, a lot of law firms are experimenting, and they're looking at, how can they incorporate different tools into supporting their clients. I think the limitation is that they start to do this experimentation. Some of them have these innovation centers, but they only roll it out to a select number of customers or clients. And I think that that's where where my recommendation to firms would be is really think about the broader customer base or client base that you have, and how can you leverage that technology to bring efficiency. I was at a conference a few weeks ago, and a law firm partner was talking about how they're doing all this cool stuff, and it was similar to what I was talking about around motion practice. And they said, yeah, and we're gonna, it's gonna reduce the amount of time that we're spending. And so I said, oh, great. So who's gonna benefit from that? So have you spoken to your customers about that? Are you gonna do alternative fee arrangements? And he's like, we're still figuring that out, right? So hopefully they have figured it out. But that's the thing, is like, how do we then roll that? How does that trickle down to benefiting our customers, including from a cost perspective? But love to hear from the other panelists on what their experience is.
Kyle, I think you were about to jump in with something.
I'll just add, in addition to that I think it's an interesting dynamic. Generative AI specifically for the broad sector, but also for the participants in the sector, service providers, both law firms and alternative service providers, because in the reality, we're talking about what could be a cannibalizing event of a product and a service, right? We all see that, and it's really hard for companies over time, no matter what the sector is or industry is, to replace a current book of business with a new technology-enabled book of business. So I do think that we should see those that do adopt and do that, sacrificing some of their current book of business, will be the ones that will boldly go forward and lead the charge.
But ultimately, hopefully, they'll win the gains down the road.
That's right.
Yeah,
So,
and I think so. And just to comment on that, I one of the things Damien was talking about earlier was, whether you think of it from an abundance mentality or a scarcity mentality, right? And I think that if you think from an abundance, then there's going to be more opportunity and there's going to be more work. And if, let's say law firms start to work differently, or law company, and we're supporting, the end customer, even though in that specific matter, we may make less because, we use technology and we're able to do it in half the time. You're building that trust, you're building that credibility, and the client is going to come back to you and say, hey, we want to do more with you. And again, their cases aren't going away and the work is just increasing. So, I like to think of it from that mindset of let's do what's right by the customer. And then I think more abundance kind of will flow back in. That's my perspective.
So before I pose the next question, Kyle, Emily, I was just curious because you do a lot of work with the general counsel community, right? Do you have a view on whether they think law firms are stepping up to the plate to the level they are, or the level of an alternative legal services provider? Did you hear that in your work?
I am not a lawyer, but I'm going to give a lawyer answer. And I think it depends on the firm. And I think it depends on the topic probably as well. It is interesting with the AI topic. My general counsel and chief compliance officer clients are most focused and worried about helping the business figure out governance around use of generative AI to better enable the business outcomes, and are not yet extremely focused on how they're going to use it. Now, there's, of course, there's an exception to every rule, right? And so I'm not stating a rule, but I would say from a trend perspective, when I speak with clients, it's all about governance and helping to enable the business to use it in a safe, secure, compliant manner, ethical manner. I think they're kind of lagging behind and maybe letting the service providers lead a little bit and figure some of this out. So I would almost flip it that with the exception of some very sophisticated, tech savvy in-house counsel and legal operations leaders, I think my experience has almost been the flip, where the in-house counsel are happy to kind of see what the service providers, including the law firms, can do as they explore and productize ideas and kind of work out some of the challenges in the process, and then they can take advantage of those. So again, a little bit of a non-answer there, but my experience
that's an interesting perspective. Well, Kyle, I'm going to start with you for this next question. And actually, I think this is, to me, the fun question in a way, and we've covered a little bit of it already, but what's the shopping list, so to speak? What are the current developments and the ways that ALSP service offerings are evolving? What do these kind of service catalogs look like? In other words, what's the cool stuff coming down the pike?
Yeah, they're pretty vast. We kind of started in the secondment, flexible talent world and with discovery services, right? But it's quickly expanded past that. And what we see now is that contracts is a big piece of it, for sure. And that looks like event-driven needs around, mass handling of agreements like acquisitions, divestitures, restructuring, things like that, as well as operational services that are being brought to market just to kind of run the business as it relates to commercial contracting, discovery, of course. Quite a bit of legal operations services are available now. So outside counsel management, sourcing. If you're at a law firm, you might find yourself sitting across from an alternative legal service provider, helping that corporation acquire your services, your advice. Tech and digital is really being leaned into now, as well as in-house departments are finding it hard to attract, retain, and manage technical talent because they're in-house counsel. They're a legal department. They're not a technology department, right? So in adoption, there's a lot of services happening there. Knowledge management, regulatory research and compliance is an area. As Emily mentioned, constant reg change is a constant need to map regulations to corporate policies, as well as understand how compliant they are or not. There's software adoption occurring in that space as well. A lot of cloud technologies that are coming available. There's other interesting things. I think IP Ops has been around for a while. I think we're seeing expansion there, as we are expansion of M&A and transactional services. There's some things happening there in antitrust relative to pre-transaction. There's a lot of things happening there in diligence and integration, as well as it relates to managing, at the end of the day, helping corporations achieve synergies that they're on the hook to deliver relative to an acquisition. For example, class action mass tort is a thing that we see a good bit of. And that's just in the services space. Another really interesting thing about the world is that the line is being blurred between service and technology, and what you might adopt from an LSP may very much look like a software, not a service. In fact, there are multiple in this category of legal companies that offer software, and they're doing that with licensable revenue models. Some of those are like pure software packages. Others are more SaaS or tech-enabled services where they have a nice tech-enabled front end, and there's some human in the loop in the background, and those are things like contracts intelligence. There's pure technologies out there as well that we see, like ELM, matter management, OS, outside counsel management, billing management, and it's interesting. Like there's strategic decisions that are being made to head in that direction, right? So hopefully that helps.
Well, and before I turn to Kenora and Emily to see what they want to add to that, I would invite everyone on the call to use the chat feature to include anything you're seeing that's maybe something we haven't mentioned. But Kenora and Emily, did you want to add anything to our shopping list of service offerings that we haven't mentioned yet?
I'm happy to. I think, and just kind of, I'd say, take a step back from that. Like when we were, when I was kind of building my first company, and then when we were building Elevate, my vision was to kind of create this, holistic enterprise solution for customers that really mimicked what, when I was practicing law, what a law firm could provide, but, providing the run the business elements to that, right? And so it is kind of everything that Kyle mentioned, and, being able to come in and say, hey, what are the customer's needs in this area, build a credibility, right? And then be able to move to other areas, whether it's kind of going from discovery to contracts to, having more of the strategic discussions, and then bringing, technology in as part of that. And so that was kind of the model that I had in mind. And, Kyle, as you were talking about the different services, like I have this one slide of kind of competitors and what that competitive landscape looks like, right? And there's some who do it all. And I'm kind of doing this circle because I think of like the Clock wheel or the legalops.com wheel, right? Which is like you have some that kind of provide the whole enterprise solution, and plus, and I'll add to that, the practice of law, right? So Elevate has a law firm through Arizona's ABS, licensing structure. So we can actually do the practice of law piece now as well. So we can kind of do that back end, run the business plus the practice of law. I mean, we've chosen not to do the bet the company cases because the value isn't there. It's really in kind of bringing the discipline of what we do at Elevate to the practice of law. So looking at portfolios and matters, but now you can actually complete that life cycle by also bringing in the practice of law. But you have some who do the enterprise, and then you have others who, as Kyle was describing it, who are either niche discovery providers or the big four, right? And kind of like what their, their area of support. And then you have the consultancies, and then you have the tech support providers. So you can, people are touching it in different ways as well. And so I think that's also an interesting way to look at is the different services and how the competitive landscape then plays out.
And I'll just add one other thing to that as it relates to the Big Four being here at the Big Four now for 4 years, and helping EY establish alternative legal services. It's interesting, right? Because, and this is kind of core to my belief in the market, should we even be thinking about these things as legal services? Yes, they are legal services, but ultimately what we're talking about is a business process. It's a value chain. And in that, legal is an actor. What we would think of traditionally as a legal advice, legal service is an actor. Really, they're purchasing, or they're selling, or they're performing R&D, and in some companies like the Big Four, we do broad things across those value chains, right? And can bring those things together. And I do think that's a very interesting value proposition for the market, in addition to being, an alternative legal service provider and being, a firm that practices law in 90 countries. So it's the lines are really blurring to me between what is advice, what is an ALSP, what's a enterprise services company, what's a software company, all those things are happening.
One big happy ecosphere, so to speak.
And exactly. It's an ecosystem. And then it's, it is, what is the problem to be solved? We're just focused in legal, right? And then kind of bringing the right solution, technology experts to design that.
So again, I'll invite everyone on the call to feel free to put something in the chat, or if you have something you'd like to say, just raise your hand and I'll be glad to call on you. But I'm going once, going twice on the subject of service offerings, and I'm going to now ask Emily another question to tell us a little bit about what pricing trends we could expect in this space.
Yeah, well, as we were talking about Gen AI earlier, I think an interesting pricing trend of some of the ALSP offerings that are packaging services, advice, technology together as, and again, it's not just generative AI, machine learning and other types of artificial intelligence and technology. I think there are active questions in the market right now about what is the value, the dollar value of some of this, because of it's offsetting time. And in an industry that's used to buying the hour, it is fundamentally helping to further shift, I think, overall pricing conversations. I don't know that that's yet settled. I think there's going to be a lot of dynamic, probably shifts and changes, and getting feedback from prospects during the sales process to try to understand what is the appropriate pricing, what will the market pay. But that's sort of a little bit of a aside. Otherwise here, I think still along the same theme of what law firms have long been experiencing, which is the pressure for value-based pricing versus the hourly rate. And I think when it comes to the ALSPs, it's no different, and that in-house legal teams are going to be pushing, and perhaps also law firms in their engagement of legal services providers to support what they're doing, they're going to be pushing harder and harder for that. And when I think about outsourcing solutions specifically too, there's variability in workload at times, and that's a great benefit that legal services providers sort of absorb and plan for and take on behalf of their client, so that their client doesn't have to staff to peaks and valleys. The service provider does that. So all of those kinds of things get factored into the pricing, of course. But I think the overarching trend, one, is going to be further and further toward the value-based pricing, the fixed fee model, the subscription, and then thinking about how the second point of how all these different kind of services or offerings are being packaged together, and appropriate pricing and knowledge sharing around that with clients and with prospects, so that people understand the value of what they're getting, and there's an alignment on the value of the services and what it's worth in the market.
Interesting. I don't know why, but what you were saying was making me think back to when I first got involved in the legal industry in 1988, actually it was. And Teresa, I have a feeling you'll be a kindred spirit on this, but I can't believe we're still talking about, in law firms at least, the billable hour as much as we are. And I really think that if anything is going to drive us away from that, finally, it just may be that there's other providers now that aren't charging by the hour. So it's an interesting thing. So, and I, again, invite any of you on the call, doesn't have to be a panelist, to unmute and raise your hand, and we'll call on you if you have something you want to add to this. But Kanor and Kyle, do you want to add anything on the whole notion of pricing of services?
One thing for me, like I was in the IT services world before I got into the legal services world, and I'm seeing something that happened in the IT services world, and then the business process outsourcing world started to happen in the legal services world. As we have, as legal service professionals, lawyers, in-house counsels, we started to adopt technology more. There's an expectation of what that adoption and those investments are going to provide over time. And this alternative world, we've been doing fixed fee for the last decade. It's kind of core to most of how we price, is fixed fee based, volume based, outcome based. And what I'm seeing now is a lot of pressure to take large chunks of cost out with scope remaining the same, or maybe even increasing in long-term deals, right? Where there is a 3 to 5 year arrangement. And that is something that IT service providers had to swallow and commit to in 5 to 10 year contracts 20 years ago. And I do believe that legal service providers are going to have to swallow and commit to those things as well, right? Which isn't an easy thing to do. It does.
Not in a partnership, certainly.
It's not an easy thing to do. You have to be prepared to effectively implement and prove to yourself and your clients that you can do that and do it profitably.
Yeah. And I think that the reason that we look at doing per unit or fixed fees is we are trying to bring that predictability. And again, working with law firms, working with the billable hour model, companies just haven't had that, right? And they get these surprise bills. And so, a lot of us, in terms of how, the services we're providing, how we're doing it, and then also the pricing, is to bring that predictability, right? And to give the customers a very different experience. But it's interesting because yesterday I was talking to a customer, and we're taking over a function that they have a law firm doing currently. And I said, okay, well, right now I don't know how long it takes. And it's a it's new, and so we'll price it per FTE. So we're going to put 5 people on it, and this is what we'll charge you. After running it for a certain amount of time, then we'll come back and we can do matter-based pricing. And they're like, well, we're trying to figure out apples to apples comparison so that we just can, sell to our internal stakeholders what the value proposition is, so we're paying, law firm this much and you this much. And so we kind of worked with the numbers a little bit. I said, well, what are you paying your law firm for this? And they're like, we're paying them $8,000 a matter. And so I said, okay, so what is that based on? Do you have metrics
Thin
around?
air?
Nothing. She's like, I don't know. It's $8,000 a matter, but I'm like, they have no data to support that. Right. And so I don't know how they kind of came up with that. And I said, okay, well, let's look at our numbers, and ours comes to like $2,000 a matter. So, I mean, we kind of, estimated that, but it was just so interesting that even though they have this fixed fee with the firm, they didn't have a sense of kind of how that was established. Right. So it's interesting.
It makes me scratch my head. When I hear a story like that, I'm always reminded of very early in my career, a lawyer had been around since the 40s. And he said back then they would pick up the file and he'd put it in his hand and he'd wait. And he said, that feels like $8,000. And that's what they would charge. And it's kind of feeling a little bit like that when you hear a story like that.
Yeah, which is why I love what Emily was talking about as the aside, which is, okay, now that we are going to start experimenting and using, these different AI-based tools, what is that going to do to the pricing, right? So if a law firm charges, whatever, 20 hours to do a motion for summary judgment, but through my law firm, we're going to use AI and we can do it in 1/4 of the time. How are we going to propose pricing? We'll definitely propose a fixed fee, but will the customer then be willing to pay half of what they would pay the law firm? Would they want, do they want to pay 1/4 because it takes us so that'll be interesting because you're still getting the value, but the price we charge may not be proportional to the amount of time that it saves, right? Because you still want to be able to account for the value, but it won't necessarily be at that full 20 hours, so I think that'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because that value won't necessarily be tied to the effort hours any longer, right? And how do you justify that? I think we have a
You're
comment.
getting a thumbs up there.
Or a comment,
I'm
Glenn.
not sure how or who did that. Glenn, go ahead. You have a question for us.
Yeah, I had a question. One of the things I've been learning about using LLMs is that you have to fine tune them with your own information. In other words, you can't just take, Chat GPT or something like that. So I'm assuming some of the big law firms are developing their own, fine tuning their own LLMs. Has there been any discussion about, because that's going to be an expensive proposition to do that type of tuning, probably. Has there been any discussion about how they're going to then price out the use of those tools? You touched on it a little bit, but I'm kind of curious about that because there will be a value proposition to using a customly trained LLM.
I definitely think happy to jump in and start and pass to other people, but I definitely think there's a lot of discussion about that right now. I don't think we've stabilized within the market in terms of what the value of that, I'll call it R&D, in terms of setting up these technologies, fine-tuning them, working with them, checking for risks, and the review that comes after the output, right? Like that may or may not go away in a lot of circumstances. It sure will expedite the process, but anyways, I think there is a lot of conversation about that currently, and I think there will continue to be a dynamic nature in the market until it establishes. And I don't know, maybe I'm conservative, but I would say that's going to be at least 1 to 2 years probably of creativity in the market, and then client reactions and calibration on pricing.
Yeah.
I don't know what my panelists think, if I'm
Yeah,
too conservative with the 1 to 2 years, but I think it's going to take a while for us to understand what the market perceives the value to be.
I agree, which is why I think that law companies have an opportunity here because we can, I think, experiment a little bit more quickly. So I mentioned those 3 use cases. We're doing that now. We're talking to the customers. We're trying to show them what the cost savings, for example, are associated with using a tool to do testimony intelligence or to do first drafts of motion practice for discovery, and we'll have that information soon. So again, it's an opportunity for law companies to experiment more quickly. And I agree. I think the law firms will take a little bit of time because they're just, it takes a little bit longer at firms, and they have to figure it out. And like you said, Glenn, they'll be fine tuning their tools. They'll be figuring out how much, human analysis is, layers around kind of the use of the technology, and then figuring out, the best way to package that for their customers.
And I'll just add, I think that it depends on how you define value too, because like, is there an applicability of investing in, training your own model data or pre and post processing for, prompt engineering LLMs? Yes, like we already see that happening. There's value to the enterprise that deploys that, but the cost is a big question too. And right now, we're very early, though it's evolving very fast. A lot of these LLMs are freemium models. All of us can go to 5 different ones right now on our PC and use them right now, right? But they don't have their economic models ironed out yet, and they will have to monetize these things. Just look at NVIDIA's earnings from last week. They are making money, booking money hand over fist to provide processors to the companies that are deploying the infrastructure, and then their applications being built on top of them. All those companies have to deploy that capital and get a return. So there's going to be a cost, and it hasn't been figured out. It's going to take a few years to get the commercial models solidified on the cost side. That's what I expect.
If
Something
anyone
related.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Emily, go ahead.
I'm just going to say something related to pricing, more on the negotiations or just kind of contracting side of getting through pricing, that I'm also expecting to increase, that I think generative AI has spurred or incited a bit more, is for clients to actually be asking legal service providers more and more about the technology that they're using and trying to understand the risks or the benefits, or both, likely both, of those use cases. And while I think in the past, particularly tech-enabled solutions that service providers offered, I didn't see a lot of clients asking a bunch of questions about the technology, like, well, how does it work? Or, asking more, of course, they ask the security questions and all the things that they need from a contracting standpoint, but not diving really into the weeds. I think service providers should start expecting more questions from clients, because I think everybody's a bit more aware or focused on this topic, and people fall on very different ends of the change curve with respect to this topic. And so I think there's going to be, just as part of the contracting and negotiation process with vendors, I think there's going to be more questions asked.
Putting on sort of the law firm hat, because that's the world I came from a long time ago. I am aware that you may have questions or comments that you want to make, but would be concerned about it because we're recording this. And if so, you're welcome to pose them to me in the chat confidentially, and I'll read them out and I disclose your identity. So feel free to do that. And I wanted to mention 2 other things before I pose the next question. And that is, towards the end of the program today, we will ask you to take a 2-question poll. So try not to leave until you do that. And I'll have a couple of announcements during that. So the next thing I want to ask about, though, is, and I'll pose this to you first, Kyle, which is, how should in-house departments be thinking about what does success look like in working with an ALSP? So, sort of any information you have on how and when the decision is made.
Sure.
Any light you can shine on that.
Yeah, I mean, even ahead of the decision, I think one of the biggest learnings I've had in the market, I've been in the ALSP market again for about 8-9 years now, is where I see customers switch from one ALSP to another. One of the big reasons that they do that is because they're not getting the value that they think they were going to get out of the ALSP that they're using. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the biggest reasons, I think, is the burden of the work that they wanted to hand off doesn't necessarily always leave them. And that might look like, signing up for, I'll use a contracting example, to handle not just not highly negotiated contracts that are template based, the things that might be a little bit more highly negotiated, maybe, where we're not on the corporation's template. There's been a struggle over time, I think, for first gen adoption to kind of climb that complexity curve. And so they're looking for that in their second provider. right? Or in their next model iteration, whatever that might be. So I think that's really one of the things to look at is what do I see in this relationship that is going to provide me the ability to confidently get this work off my plate? Because at the end of the day, I'm trying to get things off my plate as an in-house counsel or as a corporation that are lower value tasks for me, right? Where I can redeploy my resources to things that are more valuable for me to do, which might mean performing some legal advice that I'm, currently handing to a very expensive law firm that I could do more effectively and, might want to do in-house for strategic reasons, for example, or to redeploy business resources that are doing things quasi-legal per se. So I think that's one area. I think another thing to really look at is measuring everything. Let's move from that world of we don't have data to support what constitutes how much a matter costs to a world where we not only understand effort, but we understand the outputs, and the intermediate deliverables, like how fast things happen, how fast they used to happen, how fast they happen now, how much, what the compliance is, measuring compliance, measuring compliance to process, measuring compliance to policy, how that changes over time, measuring satisfaction. That's a really important thing to do. And there's a lot of ways you can measure that, but I would certainly say you should be measuring attorney satisfaction. If you're running an in-house department and you're using an ALSP, your attorneys are interacting with that ALSP and they want to get that work off their plate. So is that working out? What's that relationship look like? Measuring the business units satisfaction and working with the law department, and specifically as it relates to the things that are being provided to an ALSP to perform. So like the procurement department, for example, which, all the time interacts with legal. I think those are things to look at. And savings and productivity are certain things that kind of go hand in hand. If I'm looking to get savings, why am I doing that? There's this whole do more with less thing, lots of pressure on in-house budgets. And I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. I think it's really about how to do more with more. And I have to bring more efficient capabilities to the table. I have to bring higher utilization of tech to the table so I can get more output for a reduced cost. If that makes, because I am actually have to do more. I don't have to do less, right? So I think those are things that you should also be measuring, if that makes sense, and are very key in not only determining which vendor you should pick, but also how you should look at how I adopt that and what the value potential is for me to achieve over time.
Kenor or Emily, did you want to add anything to what in-house departments should be, in-house law departments should be thinking about? And your experiences with them? I know you both work with law departments. I think you do, Kenor. I know you do, Emily.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think Kyle's right. And I think it's so important to do that measurement and especially up front, especially if you are moving from, one provider to another. We have one customer we took over. We have 10 people taking over a significant amount of their contracting function portfolio from another incumbent. And there was a lot of nervousness around, is this going to work? Is it not? We're making the risk from moving from this company to this other company. How do we make sure it's going well? So one is just making sure that you have a really good transition plan right at that outset so that you're doing things kind of in bite-sized chunks to make sure that it is successful. And what's been really nice with this customer is that I think that they're doing a survey for the users on an ongoing basis. First, you want to start with kind of the champions, right? To make sure that you have people who will give enough feedback to make sure that things are going well, with the move to a new provider or with the move to using an outsourced provider. And then doing these surveys. So I think every month they send a survey, and we've been doing it for a year and a half or so with this one customer. And, we're getting like 9.7s out of 10 in our team. And they're like, so excited. So, thrilled by it. But they said, look, since we were moving to a new provider, we actually weren't sure. And we thought there'd be a lot more issues and a lot more mistakes. So they're thrilled with the feedback, which is great. But there's also that kind of expectation setting and understanding that at the outset, when you are moving to a different type of model, there are going to be some risks, and then just kind of, making sure you're surveying people and kind of recalibrating as needed. We have another customer who, because we started some of the work, we probably should have done it all onshore. We did some of it in a different facility, in one of our different facilities. And so there were a couple issues at the outset. And so that made some of the attorneys, who we were working with get a little concerned. And so then we had to move kind of everything domestically because it just wasn't ready to move offshore. And so in that case, again, it didn't go perfectly right away, we got the feedback when we were able to recalibrate. So that feedback is really, really important, because ultimately the success is, are they going to continue using you? How many people are using you, and are they comfortable, with that shift?
Emily, do you want to add anything?
I would just briefly add, I think even as we were preparing for this panel, we each sit in a different solution that is part of legal service providers. And as was talked about in the intro, there's been a lot of consolidation and a lot of certain companies who are focused on serving all of the needs of the general counsel, for example. And so I think when it comes to what does success look like and what does selection look like, it's really dependent on what kind of service are we even talking about. Because now the ALSPs, they do so many things. And I think we certainly the majority is more on the staffing, flex staffing, and the outsourcing side of things. I think from the total fees and from the history, but I do think that kind of decision making really gets into the weeds of very specifically what solutions are you trying to get, because different providers are probably better positioned to do different types of services at this point. But I do think we'll continue to see the market change and companies consolidate or innovate and expand service offerings. So I think that'll continue to change.
So, and we are going to do a deep dive on predictions in a minute, and I want to leave enough time for that. But just one more environment that we should talk about. We've mentioned law firms a few times, and in terms of being competitors or losing market share potentially to different kinds of legal services providers. But I also see there's a lot of partnership and partnering going on. So can we maybe talk a little bit about how law firms can utilize ALSPs, and if is there space for everyone in the marketplace?
Yep, absolutely. Definitely a lot of space, as I mentioned early on. And it's interesting, I came from big law. And so when I started my company, I thought, oh, wow, law firms are going to be the one that will use the services we're providing. I think they can benefit from it. I think it'll make them more competitive. They're doing right by the customer. And let me tell you, 20 years ago, that value proposition was not selling. I still strongly believe in that. And I do think law firms are coming along, sometimes kicking and screaming, unfortunately, and it is customer driven, right? In terms of encouraging them to look at how to operate more efficiently. But I think we can be there and kind of help you, law firm. We can help you really support your customers. And so I'd say law firms are about half of our customer base. I think maybe it's 60-40, customer heavy, but with law firms, I think they can kind of use the a la carte model, which is, hey, let's look at how we can do e-discovery or even transactional support better through a service center. And I think we've worked with law firms in that capacity. I think there's one of our law firm customers who we've spoken to, and they're like, hey, we'd like to go and talk to one of our mutual corporate customers about taking over their entire contracting portfolio. Now, there's going to be, if you kind of look at a grid, there's going to be, the more complex core critical contracts, that we will do internally at the firm. But then there's that kind of lower complexity piece, Elevate, that we'd want you to do, because that just doesn't make sense for us to do NDAs, right? Or Elevate, you might do some of the consulting around process optimization for contracts or sourcing of a CLM or a technology tool, because we don't do that. So it's like, how can we partner to take on an entire portfolio of work, which otherwise we wouldn't have the capability to do so, and it wouldn't be cost effective, right? So kind of allowing them to bring these different types of products. I think that's an opportunity with firms. And the other is, we have one of our corporate customers who is all fixed fee with their law firms, right? So whether a law firm gets 1 matter or 10 matters, there's a certain fixed fee assigned to that. So in that type of a model, it absolutely makes sense for a law firm to think about, what is the most cost-effective way for me to do this, right? How do I right source this to the right talent using the right process and technology globally? So that's where it's like, hey, don't use your highly paid and costing associates to do work that an Elevate can do, right? Let us provide you with your flexible resources as well. When you have to give a secondment to this company, let us provide you with that secondee, so that you're not, again, moving that highly paid associate, which is going to cost you a lot more. Helping them with process so that they can figure out how to better support to a fixed fee. So I think there's so much opportunity. for law firms. I think the last two examples I gave may resonate more with law firms because it kind of goes to their bottom line. The other one allows them to, is really them thinking differently about how do we approach our customers. We provide support globally, and I'd say that we have law firms in the UK and law firms in Australia who seem to be a little bit more progressive in terms of using law companies to support their customers.
And Kyle, I would love to hear you weigh in on this a little bit, because my sense and feeling from, working with law firms all over the world is the big four feel like a bigger threat than other kinds of law companies. And do you work closely with law firms in any capacity from E&Y Legal?
We do, yes. We do extensively as it relates to investigations and discovery. So we work hand in hand with them. We also work with law firms, though not in a direct business relationship, side by side, and a good bit of corporate transactions, law matters. So yeah, and just my take on it is, right, like I can see why a law firm would think that, but EY is not a law firm. We just have 90 law firms in the affiliate
Right.
network. That's the way I always encourage people to think of it. And there's a lot of lawyers. There's over 4,000. So it's not insignificant, but it's also more related to the work that we do for enterprises and attaching legal advice to that. It's not about being the world's largest law firm, right? So we kind of know
Similar
where we
to the network I
Yeah.
run. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I want to make sure we have enough time for the predictions that I've asked the panelists to think about, and also for just a little bit of the feedback at the end. So I'm going to turn my attention to that, and I'm going to ask each of you to give your predictions about the future of legal service providers. I'm not going to use the word alternative here, in the future. So Emily, you want to start?
Sure. 2?
However many you want. Just
Okay.
leave a little
Well,
time for Kenor and Kyle.
I probably accidentally already shared some of these things, but I'm going
Yes,
to be
that's
brief.
fine.
So one, I think we're going to see more consolidation. I think Kenor talked about this as well. I think there's going to be more legal service providers that want to be a one-stop shop, and we're going to see there's a lot of M&A activity going on in the legal services market currently and over the last year, and I think that's going to continue. So that would be one. And then secondly, I think we're going to see more creativity. I think we're going to see more creativity from the perspective of the legal service providers and the offerings, and also digging into more nuanced or really industry specific areas to expand the breadth and the detail of the services that they provide, and really leaning in to certain industries as well, trying to set themselves apart from their competitors. So I think we're going to see those two things amongst probably many other things that I said today.
What about you, Kyle? You want to predict next?
Yeah, just
You can be the cleanup batter.
Yeah, without kind of piling on, but I'll just kind of take a little different perspective on what Emily shared, leaning into industry. I think the legal services market generally is thought about that as expertise, right? Expertise in an industry applied. I do expect, and we've seen it, right? We did this at Axiom and Factor and Knowable when I was in that world, and it's happening now in the Big Four, and I think in other alternative legal service providers, where there are assets being built that are focused on an industry or a sector or a specific process within a sector that has outsized potential for value creation if the legal operation could improve in that area. Areas like pharma R&D, for example, where the stakes are very high, or derivatives trading, where the revenue is very high. There's a lot of specialization in those spaces. I expect that this continues and it starts to filter out into a lot of sectors over time. And I alluded to this earlier, kind of the blurring lines between, is this a technology? Is this a service? What am I using here? Look at Entre. If you haven't found them, they're doing this in private equity in a very, very strong way. I think that's an interesting company to look at, where it's a service company, but really looks like software, and it is highly software. Knowable, a company I was with before I came to EY, software as a service based contracts intelligence capability. You're interacting with the software. There's humans in the loop. I expect more and more of that, and it's happening pretty fast. It's kind of an exciting
I was
time.
just thinking pretty rapidly. Yeah. And Kenor, your predictions.
I agree with both Emily and Kyle. I think the first is that it is a holistic enterprise solution, and that includes the practice of law. I think law companies more will have, the law firm associated with it, and being able to provide the holistic solution. Again, sitting next to a law firm, I don't think it needs to be competitive. And the second is that, I think, Kyle, what you're getting at is, in the end, it is what is the solution that I'm getting? And right now, I think clients pick it apart a little bit. What technology are you using? Where are the resources going to be? And ultimately, I don't think that matters. It's, what is the problem to be solved? We're going to approach that problem with experts, with technology in an integrated way where it doesn't matter where it's being done. We're just going to be providing that solution. So I think changing the mindset from unbundling how it's being done to here's the solution that is expert-led, software-powered, AI-driven as well.
Love it. So before I turn this over to Debbie to launch this poll, and I have a couple of announcements while she does that, I'd like to just give the audience one more chance to ask a question. You can either raise your virtual hand or post something in the chat. Just give you a second to do that. This has been a phenomenal program. I learned a lot and really found it interesting. So thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you to Peter, who is on the call, who helped to put this whole thing together, and appreciate all of the work that you did behind the scenes on this. And I will, Debbie, let you launch the poll. And while Debbie is doing that, I have a couple of things just to remind you about. One is the Futures Conference will be in Washington, D.C., March 12th and 13th. There's a phenomenal program lined up if you haven't signed up for it yet. And if you haven't been to a Futures Conference, they're always a blast on top of informative and educational. So check out the information on the college's website. And then I did want to mention that the next Futures Forum webinar will be on May 7th at 10 a.m. Central. And the topic is strategic planning. I'm actually moderating that one as well because I lined up the two speakers who are a real treat to listen to, Julia Hayhoe and William Bill Johnston. Julia was formerly the head of global strategy at Baker McKenzie, and Bill was the first director of strategic planning for Cravath. So some really interesting perspectives. All right, Debbie's launched the poll, so please take a moment to answer her questions, sorry. And Debbie, I don't know how you want me to, I can't tell people have answered or not.
Yeah, they're responding.
Okay, good. There's a second question when she's done, so bear with us for just a moment.
Yeah, they're both on the screen available to
Oh,
respond.
yes, I'm sorry. That if you scroll down, you'll see the second question. The first one is, how would you rate the quality of today's session? And the second one is, how likely are you to recommend College of Law Practice Management virtual meetings to a colleague or friend? While you're finishing that up, I just wanted to thank everyone for attending today. The recording will be available in a few days on the college's website. And Debbie, do you send that out to everyone who attended or not? I couldn't remember.
The recording.
Yes.
We generally send a follow-up email,
Okay.
but otherwise you can go to the homepage of the website and we'll have a link right on the homepage.
Great. Okay. Do you have all the responses you need, Debbie?
I do.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. And thank you so much to our panelists. Very, very helpful. Thanks, everybody.
Everyone, great to see you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.